As a constitutional law attorney, former senior legal advisor and personal counsel to President Donald J. Trump, Jenna Ellis believes in the rule of law and the importance of integrity in our elections. And she's ready to tackle the big cultural and legal issues facing America. This is the Jenna Ellis Show. Here is your host, Jenna Ellis.
Happy Wednesday, friends, and welcome to another episode of the Jenna Ellis Show. Today, I'm going to be talking with a good friend from Judicial Watch. Of course, that's Tom Fitton's group, Russ Nobile. He's been an attorney with the group since 2019 and testified before Congress last week on the Voting Rights Act and a number of other things related to election integrity. So we're going to get to that conversation. But first, Legacy Precious Metals is the company that I trust to give you good and patient counsel for investing in your retirement. The Biden administration has caused a financial crisis, and they have no clue how to fix it. Oil prices have skyrocketed, and when oil prices go up, not only do your expenses go up, but the cost of transportation and shipping spikes, leading the prices of goods to rise. And we are already seeing record inflation. That's the last thing that we need. Our economy is in trouble, and you need to take steps to protect yourself. If all your money is tied up in stocks, bonds, and traditional markets, you may be vulnerable. So gold is one of the very best ways to protect your retirement. No matter what happens, you own your own gold. It's real, it's physical, and it's always been valuable since the dawn of time. Call Legacy Precious Metals today at 866-528-1903 or visit them online at legacypminvestments.com. That's legacypminvestments.com, where you can download the free investor's guide. You can also go to my Facebook page, Jenna Ellis. I am a public figure on Facebook, and I just posted yesterday a really great interview with the president of Legacy Precious Metals, who is discussing why you need to start your retirement account even if you're in your 20s or 30s. There is always a great time to protect your retirement and invest, just like you want to protect your health over the long term. So go to Legacy Precious Metals at legacypminvestments.com or call 866-528-1903. Well, now turning to election integrity and the importance of all of these issues. Yesterday, of course, was the conversation with Ken Blackwell. If you missed that, definitely go and subscribe to the Jenna Ellis Show on all the podcast platforms or on YouTube and Rumble, and make sure that you never miss an episode. But joining me now is Russell Nobile, who joined Judicial Watch's legal team as a senior attorney in May 2019. Nobile has appeared before congressional committees and federal courts across the country, including last week when he testified regarding the Voting Rights Act. I think, of course, that was a misnomer and misnamed by the Democrats. But joining me now is Russ from Judicial Watch to talk about that testimony. So, Russ, thanks so much for joining.
Yeah, Jenna, thanks. It's nice to see you. Thank you for having me. It's nice to join you today. I'm excited to follow Ken. Ken's doing great work, and so it's nice to be in the same conversation with him.
Yeah, and we have so many great allies from so many great conservative groups that want to protect election integrity. And one of the key points that you made to the committee is how this term of, voter suppression and some of these things that the Voting Rights Act apparently, according to them, seeks to remedy are just not in fact or truth or the substantive record. And I'm really grateful to be part of a community of great organizations like Judicial Watch, like AFPI. Of course, I'm the chairperson of the Election Integrity Alliance with the American Greatness Fund. So many great partners across the country who see the dangers of the Democrats not only manipulating the narrative, but now also trying to manipulate the law. So as you're looking at the Voting Rights Act, kind of break that down and what you saw as the biggest flaws and dangers of federalizing the election system, because we know that even though thankfully that failed, the Democrats aren't going to stop, and Joe Biden even said that.
Yeah, I mean, they had 3 or 4 different bills, but they all largely had, 5 or 6 of the major same components. Then some had some campaign finance issues. I mean, the big thing is that, they were looking for federalizing and taking control of elections and draconian regulations that were well beyond anything that were looked at in 1965. And so, the whole argument for it is that this, what I touched on in my testimony, at least my verbal testimony, is that they paint this dystopian view that people aren't allowed to vote and that there's this massive problem, and And, there are always problems at poll sites. You can get a camera out and find everything. And so you can take one thing and amplify it enough and everyone will believe it. But this idea that they're going to take control of the elections, all state elections or state elections, and just run them out of D.C., it's impossible. I mean, I worked at the DOJ for about 9 years or 7 years, and then in the voting section for about 5 or 6 years, and they're just not going to be capable of doing that, even if we wanted them to do that, which we don't, but they're just not capable of doing that. I mean, the legislation, it wanted to take over all redistricting nationwide. I mean, if they didn't have a justification to take over redistricting in Idaho in 1965, I don't know why they have a justification in 2022. And a lot of these voting wars, they started with Bush v. Gore, but then they really amplified in 2008 when the Supreme Court said that voter ID was legal, right? The Supreme Court upheld Indiana's voter ID, and so there was this massive effort. They upheld the constitutionality of it, but there's been this massive effort to sort of take a statutory approach to it using the Voting Rights Act to try to carve it up. And then after the Shelby County case in 2013, where they struck down Section 5, there's just been this free-for-all of pushing this voter suppression narrative. I mean, one point I tried to make in my testimony the other day was that, in 2008, after voter ID was upheld, they said that, minorities weren't going to be allowed to vote, and all this sort of Chicken Little stuff, this massive voter suppression. And what we've seen in the last 13 years is largely that minority participation and turnout has gone up. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, if you really want to extrapolate anything from that, you can make the argument. I'm not saying this is the case because I'm not a data scientist, but you can make the argument that there's a strong correlation between voter ID and minority turnout. And so these things that they're complaining are going to happen never come to fruition, and yet they're still making these complaints in order to have a federal takeover of elections. One other thing they had in this legislation that it always sort of got me revved up was that it gave the Attorney General 14th Amendment standing. And it doesn't mean a lot of stuff to non-lawyers, but heretofore, the AG has never been able to get into Second Amendment cases, abortion cases, any of the substantive due process cases. The Attorney General in the United States can't just get in the middle of a suit just because they don't like something. They have to have standing just like everybody else. And they gave the Attorney General 14th Amendment standing. So who's ever controlling the Justice Department could sway really significant civil rights issues well beyond voting. And that, it's just, to me, it's just mind-boggling because it would have obviously been highly corrosive. DOJ policy would have been even worse than it is now. But so anyway, it's fortunate that it failed. Hopefully this is the end of it. I actually testified 4 times since May about it. And the one last week was sort of, peculiar because it had already failed in the Senate. So I got the sense it was really more of a venting session for the advocacy groups, and we were just there to sort of go along for the ride. But hopefully this will be the end of it for a while, and then we'll just see how the 2022 elections go and then go from there.
Yeah, and hopefully with that testimony on the record, we at least as conservatives are making the case and having it on the congressional record why we object to some of these just ridiculous and far overbroad insertions. And I think a lot of people don't understand some of the points that you just made of why this legislation was so overbroad and touching on things that really don't have any impact or relevance specifically to elections, even though what it did try to change in elections was highly problematic, highly unconstitutional, but also how overbroad this was. And now there have been reports that they're trying to insert some things into some legislation around NASA, and they're trying to insert some of these election integrity issues in all kinds of things, almost like they do with omnibus bills, where they're trying to just put this anywhere that they possibly can. And so it seems like Democrats are trying to just include what they think is best for elections in any legislation, hoping that somewhere it passes without notice. So are there anything other than potentially the NASA bill or other things that you anticipate where they're going to try to sneak in some of this thing into other legislation?
I mean, I don't think that they're done yet. I mean, they obviously expressed the desire to keep going. I don't know anything off the top of my head about sort of their next sort of strategy to try to get it through the Senate. They sort of failed pretty monumentally in the last couple of weeks, and so I think they may try to move on to something maybe where they've got more success. I was really heartened by the fact that maybe some of the softer Republicans sort of held firm on it. There's always this thing where, look, I'm an election lawyer. I'm a conservative election lawyer. I want everyone to vote. The chips will fall where they lie. And so, there is, some sentiment there where like, oh, of course, we support people voting, but that's not what this is. This is literally they're trying to decentralize and centralize the control of elections in D.C. Now, there are some concerns about sort of the Electoral Count Act, the things that happen post-election inside the Congress. I've heard, there's a Wall Street Journal article the other day that some people were talking about that. I haven't seen anything. I haven't been involved in that. Obviously, anytime someone starts tinkering with it, I just imagine they're going to make it much broader than they are. But I'll sit quietly by and see what the Senate comes up with, and then probably rail against it. But I'll wait to see what it is at that point.
Right, and actually see what the text is and what's being put forward. And you mentioned Section 5 in the Shelby case. Why is that important, and how did that change kind of the dynamic of how we're moving forward?
So all right, so the Voting Rights Act passed in 1965, and it had two big statutes. Section 2, which basically said can't discriminate, and then Section 5 that basically said in certain particular states, all election laws are invalid until they're either approved by a federal court in D.C. or the DOJ. And so basically, it solved the whack-a-mole problem that sort of came up in the Jim Crow era, right? Because every time they came up with something new, the Southern Jim Crow segregationists would just come up with something to go around it. And so think of it like as an injunction stopping all changes until they're approved. And that was justified probably in 1965 and for some period of time afterwards, because it was just impossible to deal with it all. But finally, it was supposed to be a temporary statute. I think it was like 10 years maybe, but they've renewed it for almost 60 years. And so what ended up happening was in 2013, the Supreme Court came and said, no, this temporary measure is no longer justified based on the evidence that Congress is relying on. And so it struck down the coverage formula because it covered, the southern states for the most part. And what the Supreme Court pointed out, and what I pointed out in my testimony the other day, is that actually, when you talk about ballot access, you got to look at voter registration data and turnout. And, in a lot of the Section 5 states that were covered by Section 5, minority turnout and registration is actually higher than whites. Not in all of them, but there's no longer disparity in there, right? I mean, in 1965, when the Voting Rights Act was passed, my home state of Mississippi had 6.4% black voter registration with a 40%, African American population. I mean, that's just indefensible. And so, there was a problem and democracy was failing, right? But that's not the case anymore. Everyone can vote. Everyone has numerous outlets to register to vote, and they're actually turning out. And so when you say that there's not this ballot access and there's all this voter suppression, and then turnout and registration is still going up, there's a disconnect between the data and the narrative. And, there's just big money, unfortunately. There's just big money in claiming voter suppression, and it's
twisting that term. Voter suppression to the Democrats is now basically any form of verification of a legal ballot. And for them to go back to this Jim Crow era and to think that somehow we're still in the 1960s related to some of these issues just doesn't comport with fact. And to actually have verification that is across the board, it's not discriminatory, and it's not somehow disparately treating anyone in terms of ballot access. I mean, they can't provide, and I haven't seen any data whatsoever in our current era to in any way suggest or be a defense for those types of claims that voter ID, for example, is barring anyone or is some kind of substantial burden to anyone who is otherwise legally eligible to vote having ballot access. And so these types of terms, Russ, are being manipulated by the leftist narrative because, of course, anyone and any conservative, as you said, we want people to vote. We want a high voter turnout, and we want free and fair elections. And there have been candidates for all kinds of offices, including the president, that have been against how I voted. And, I didn't vote for Obama, but he was elected. I didn't vote for, or support a lot of Democrats in elections where I've been eligible that have gotten into office. That's just how it goes in a constitutional republic where we're allowed to vote. But what isn't true is that conservatives are trying to suppress the vote by having verification methods. And so in your testimony, was there any clash from anyone in particular or even support with Republicans in Congress that actually get this and were trying to combat the leftist narrative?
The way it works is, first off, on the Jim Crow point, is frustrating and is monumentally is mystifying, as I think I said it was, that they chose that narrative. It was almost heartening when they started saying Jim Crow 2.0, because at that point it's failing, right? Because everyone knows what Jim Crow was, and it's just too graphic to even go into here. It was a horrible period in our time, and it never needs to be repeated. But it's not going on right now. And so, that's the point I tried to make, that, if you call what's going on Jim Crow 2.0 right now, it's really just proof that you don't know what Jim Crow 1.0 was, and you don't know what election administration, right? So, there's been time, place, and manner regulations for everything. But in terms of, banter back and forth in the hearing, I think the Democrats were happy to ignore us and focus on their witnesses. They probably didn't want to give us much time to respond about sort of the disconnect with reality that we were hearing. Yeah, and so we sort of, they sort of ignored us. Congressman Johnson from Louisiana, Congressman Roy both participated pretty vigorously the other day. It's actually,
sure they did. I love Mike Johnson. Just so listeners know, you have to follow him on Twitter. He's one of the most outstanding lawyers. He used to be part of the Beckett Fund in ADF, and has done a lot of litigation and constitutional issues, and is just one of the most outstanding members of Congress, and someone that I consider a personal friend. He and his wife Kelly are great Christians, and anyway, I'm glad that you mentioned that he's pushing back in the hearing, because he's fantastic for people who don't follow Mike Johnson.
Yeah. Congressman Johnson and Roy, they were the only two Republicans there that day, and they were excellent. They're sharp on it. Congressman Roy, I think, worked on the 2006 Voting Rights Act legislation, and then Congressman Johnson were both really, really good to have on our side and have at the hearing.
Great. And, and now it seems like the next step that the leftists are going in the aftermath of this just total failure, really, is that they're now going to use the 2020 election and the irregularities there, and all of the ways that, of course, there were legal challenges to the results of that election, and using that as a pretext to now say, well, that was totally fictitious, and that was just the Republicans now trying to pave the way to having states implement a lot of different reforms that are unjustified. And so, Russ, as we're looking at some of the state legislation and some of the good things that have passed in Georgia, for example, and purging voter rolls and contemplating, okay, do we actually have security in our elections? What on earth is wrong with saying, let's make sure that we have the most secure elections that don't have any sort of suppression mechanisms at all, but we're just making sure that we have, for example, the right voter rolls, that we purge, that we don't have any dead people voting, for example, that we don't have people who are otherwise not eligible putting forward a vote. What's wrong with that, and what's wrong with any of these bills that are being put forward in the state legislature to make sure to ensure the safety and security of the vote?
Yeah, it's really peculiar. With the talking points that came out of the legislative fight the last 2 weeks, it was sort of funny because you could really see the birth of a new narrative, right? This whole who gets to count your votes? It's who's going to be able to count your vote and all that. And of course, this legislation has nothing to do with who counts your vote. It just makes sure that there's sort of an orderly administration of elections, which is something that we used to do voice votes in the 19th century, and then we decided that voice votes weren't good, so you had to bring your own piece of paper to write down. And then they decided that wasn't good. Then the parties came up with this idea of a ticket, and they gave you a ticket, and you put it in the box. And so there's been all these innovations that sort of helped ensure the integrity of an election. And so this idea that stopping people, harassing people in line for voting. The people that are most affected by harassment in line at voting are the poor minority communities, right? This idea that they will literally go to your project or your housing unit and escort you to the poll site. And when they do that, if you don't go along with it, there's an admission that maybe you don't support their candidate, and it could be a problem there. I mean, I've seen it when I was at DOJ at different places, and so some of this stuff, in fact, does protect minority voters from harassment. I mean, this idea of at-home voting, I mean, it sounds great, but I mean, I don't know why you want to bring the voting experience to your house personally. I mean, I'd be happy to just leave the voting, the election site to begin with, but this thing where, we're at home mail balloting where, somebody will have an iPod or iPad, and go to your house and check and make sure you voted and do all that stuff and have continual people harassing you. It doesn't really sound appealing to me, and so.
And it's not freedom and liberty either, because as much as we obviously encourage people to exercise their right to vote, they also do have a right to not participate and abstain.
Correct.
We even see Congress doing that all the time.
There's a lot of people, and I'm not passing judgment on it, but there's a lot of people that don't want to register because they don't want to do jury duty. And that's, I had people tell me that I don't register because I don't want to do jury duty. And I mean, I can understand it. I like to vote, so I'll do it. But there's lots of things that I probably do that people wouldn't make sense of either. So, you have places like, without going into too many specifics about states, but like Wisconsin, their voter registration list is a mess. It's an absolute mess. But they're not subject to the NVRA, the National Motor Voter Bill, right? So, where we can sue other states over list maintenance practices, Wisconsin's got a carve out because they have same-day registration, which honestly creates a twofold problem. One, they're not registered. They have this sort of high volume of registration on election day, which I would think probably has a higher level of inaccuracies, just given the rush of voting and everything at the poll site. And then two, they're not regularly maintained compared to other states, which is required to do so by federal law. So it's this weird virtue signaling almost that it's like this idea that the least secure elections as possible or more legitimate, and it's the exact opposite the way most people would think, right? You would want the more security or the more balance between access and security, the more legitimate the elections are. But now they just want to have as little security as possible, and they just you're supposed to trust the outcomes, and it's just not the way people work.
Yeah, and it flies in the face of reason and logic and is purely partisan politics. And what did you make of President Biden saying in the aftermath of the Voting Rights Act failing, he basically condemned and said that he thinks that the 2022 election will now be illegitimate on face because we didn't federalize U.S. elections. That's just complete and totally moronic.
Well, it was sort of shocking to see. I've seen politicians challenge the legitimacy of election. I've been in this space for about 16 years now.
Yeah, President Trump was not the first.
No, it happened with. But what's funny is, I talk about this internally. Like, human nature is such that people will always strive for a competitive advantage. We do it. People cheat in sumo wrestling. They cheat in cheerleading. The original Greek Olympics had cheating. All sorts of, but for some reason, when people go into the ballot box, there's suddenly this level of altruism and virtue that no one ever cheats, and people cheat in elections. They just do. It's making the decisions as who gets to control the proceeds from the federal government, and so it is. And so this idea that you're going to sort of preemptively challenge the legitimacy before the qualifying deadline is it's a very worrisome turn. I've never seen that happen so early. Every election, we knew it going into 2020, like every election, there's this bankroll of money or campaigns or whatever, and they always go to sue to change the rules. And 2020 it happened, 2018, 2016, it always happens. And it was worse last year, but, to see them challenge the legitimacy of a congressional election 10 months in advance is something I've never seen before in the time period I've been doing this.
Yeah, and it's amazing how much, even though these issues have always been present, and you said you've observed this over the last 16 years, and certainly that didn't just cover the 2020 election, but now that this has become such a highly politicized issue because it's in the common everyday conversation among politically astute Americans and anyone who just, understands what's going on in our country, it seems like it's so overly politicized. And you're right that in any sort of contest, everyone knows that the person who can create or manipulate the rules of the game have the advantage, because whatever the rules say, and however you measure the win or the loss, that ultimately and obviously impacts the outcome. And so Democrats have been doing this for a long time, but now that they're being so blatant and obvious about it, what do you anticipate will be the next step of how they're going to try to continue to manipulate the narrative and to continue to have this ridiculous talking point of voter suppression? I mean, it's not working out for them, but we're seeing that they clearly aren't winning on, their policy stances or Joe Biden's popularity. So what do they have left?
That's a very good question. I mean, the policy, I've never seen anything fail as much as the failure to convince America that voter ID is bad. I mean, it's got 80+% support in the country. I don't think you can get 80% of people in any room to agree on much, but you can get 80% of Americans to agree on voter ID. So it's really been a monumental failure, which has sort of been warming to see. As to their next tactic, that's a good question, and I just don't know at this point. Usually they always try to extend early voting, and they try to do certain things because of some unforeseen issue that pops up. Not all that different than what they did, in 2020. But I just don't know. I don't know the sort of the flavor it'll take in 2022. But you can rest assured there'll be litigation filed like there always is, and it'll be. Everyone will run into court with their hair on fire, and they'll act like they got to have, this relief that they would never get except for the time pressures. And it just sort of depends on how it goes. We've had some pretty good success on some of the things we do. We're trying to figure out where we can make a difference and sort of curtail it a little bit. There's some things that, unfortunately, if the legislator passes it and the governor signs it, there's not a lot of things you can do, because that's why we have a decentralized system, right? Because if there is a problem in one state, it's firewalled off, right? And so the problems in California don't seep into everything else, and the problems in Georgia don't seep into everything else. And so we'll just have to see what they come up with.
Yeah, and kind of take it one step at a time, because they're not necessarily showing or tipping their hand on their next playbook, and maybe they don't even know yet. Wouldn't that be great? To see that they're kind of scrambling, perhaps they didn't think that this was going to be such an epic failure. But as far as Judicial Watch is concerned, I know you're a C3, and that's nonpartisan. But looking at where the litigation was ahead of the 2020 election, do you think that conservative groups and even some of the partisan ones like the GOP, the RNC did get involved, and in my opinion, of course everyone knows that my opinion was the GOP utterly failed to do as much litigation as they should have in the COVID pretext ahead of the 2020 election. But do you think that groups that are concerned about the safety and integrity of our legitimate election results have learned any lessons from 2020 as far as pre-litigation and some of these things that we need to get ahead of prior to the actual election, and not just try to do kind of the accident reconstruction after the fact in terms of litigation?
Yeah, I think people have. I think they have learned something. Have they learned enough? I guess honestly, time will tell. From the election integrity standpoint, you're always in a different posture, right? Because a lot of times, the liberal-leaning groups will bring the affirmative case, the lawsuit, and then we'll try to get in there, or a conservative group will try and get in there to either to defend the state law, because usually it's the liberal groups are trying to suspend certain laws so they can do whatever they want to do, and so it's always in a weird posture. I think, the big problem, of course, has just been courts. I think people until 2020 underestimated the willingness of courts to avoid making difficult issues, because courts just hate election cases. I always joke there's nothing sort of sadder than watching a guy or a woman with an Article 3 appointment desperately trying to get out of having to make a difficult decision on an election case, because they've got all these perks of being a federal judge, and then when you're there and there's no way out for them to avoid it, usually they get sort of desperate.
Yeah, that you raise a really great point that I've been ranting on for the last year when we saw the federal judiciary just basically want to just say, hey, we don't want to get involved at all because it's political. And obviously they do avoid as much as they can some of the more politically contentious, but that's the entire reason the judicial branch is supposed to be non-political, is because they know that things coming from the two political branches are going to be contentious. And that's just, elections have winners and losers. That's going to be contentious. And so they need to step in and say, this is not about one candidate over another. It's not about partisan politicking. This is about making sure that everything is fair. They've gotten involved in gerrymandering cases, for example. Just things that they absolutely have to decide and to arbitrate to make sure that elections are secure and fair for everyone. And so, what is your take on why a lot of these so-called conservative Article 3 judges aren't willing to get involved and say, you know what, it sucks, but this is part of my job, is to be the umpire? It would be no different than an umpire at the Super Bowl who's willing to put on the uniform, like a judge on the bench willing to put on a robe and saying, you know what, I'm going to make half the country, if it's, Patriots versus Cowboys, whatever, clearly I don't know football that well, but it's like one of the two teams, I'm going to make their fans mad and the other half of the country happy based on this call. But that's not the point. The point is you call it fairly and you make the call.
That's a good question. I think a lot of times judges have a good bit of control over what they're doing, right? And in most cases settle. I don't know what the statistics are. 95% of the cases settle. But when you have, like I said, you've got the RNC or the DNC or some campaign coming in or somebody, and they've lit their hair on fire and they're screaming about they got to get this done, and they just are afraid to make a decision. And I get it, it's tough, but if you get the robe, you gotta make the call. You're welcome to not be a judge, but their cases, they just have to do it. And I think that's sort of the one thing that stood out. So I think people are seeing. The lessons we've learned in the last time period, 18 months or whatever. I think people have figured it out a little bit better. I think there's just this inherent difficulty with sort of like when we bring a list maintenance case to try to clean up the voter registration list. Like, we're bringing that case, we're the plaintiff, we get to pick where we're going, we get to pick the fight, we get to pick the place that has the best facts. And so there's no time crunch, right? Because you can't do list. The federal law is such that you can't start cleaning up the voter registration list right before an election. Mm-hmm. And even if you do, there's a cycle that gets people removed.
Which makes sense. Because that may be used and manipulated for actual voter suppression. So things like that make sense.
Yeah, and the list maintenance stuff is. I don't know. With list maintenance is you move from active voter to inactive voter, and there's basically 4 years or 2 federal election cycles before you're actually removed. And so, it's not like it happens overnight. Even when we get relief, it's still follow federal law and have these people, start the process for removing these people 4 years from now. But, those aren't time-sensitive cases, right? Obviously we want relief as soon as possible, but we're never showing up in June asking the judge to give us relief before the November 2022 election. So,
and I think that's an important point for people as well, because a lot of Americans tend to, we're a very consumer-driven culture with instant gratification, and a lot of times people just frankly don't understand that the process does take time, and that even trying to utilize the lessons of 2020 and even, well prior to that, and having these ongoing battles, election integrity is going to be a long-standing process, and it's not just as quick as saying, okay, we're going to pass some overnight reforms. And that's actually an intentional process element of our judicial branch, and also even of of the legislature. It's a good thing we can't just quickly do things. There are limits on executive orders. The president can't just, with the phone and the pen, legislate, or even sometimes if he tries to, so these things are built in to make sure that one side can't manipulate. And a lot of what I get from listeners that is understandable, but I think what you're helping kind of elucidate here is that this is an ongoing battle that's not as simple as just, election integrity is going to change overnight.
Yeah, I mean, that's exactly right. I mean, there's a federal statute, the Motor Voter Bill, also known as the NVRA, and, if I had written something and could get enough senators to agree with me, it'd probably be different. But it is what we've got, and we just have, our thing is just to follow the law. And even if we don't like it, they just got to follow it. And, there's a process. We don't want people, because there's all sorts of reasons why people don't vote. But I mean, and so they shouldn't be removed unilaterally on day one. And they're not, and they never are. And so, when people say they're doing this massive purge, that's never the case. It's not as interesting to sort of explain the tedious nature of voter removal, but it just doesn't happen the way it's reported a lot of times. And what's been great in the last year or so is seeing the different groups that are doing election integrity stuff, and they all have their little niches, right? I mean, like there's certain groups that we have people we work with that are doing list maintenance in different states, and then people are have ideas about how they should do it in their state, and it's great because it's generating all this discussions, and some ideas are good and some ideas could be better, and but it's all happening, and that's sort of the organic way that law is made in America, right? Somebody comes up with a new concept and they test it out and they try it out, and their state legislator may or may not adopt it, and then it goes from there. And so it's been interesting to see how it worked out, and I think elections will be better going forward. Doesn't mean they're going to be clean, right? I mean, because unfortunately elections have always been in the time period I've been watching, they're all helter-skelter, right? I mean, you don't see election problems when there's a landslide, right? That's the prayer of an election administrator, is always a landslide.
Yeah,
so,
it's so clear one way or another. But that's the other interesting point, that Democrats, of course, in the aftermath of 2020 are seeking to almost criminalize challenging election results. And I'm thinking, like, well, wait a second. This is not the first time that any candidate has contested the outcome, especially when the margins are so small in a lot of significant counties and states. And so, moving forward, I think it's important for the American people, and especially, those on the left who maybe are moderate Democrats, or at least reasonable Democrats, in the sense that, okay, they disagree with Republicans on issues like pro-life and some other things, but they would at least agree with us that elections need to be free and fair. They need to understand that contesting elections is part of the process, and to make sure that we get to an accurate finding of the result, and that this isn't something that's just brand new in American history, or that this has never happened before, and to preserve the ability of candidates to have standing, and that you don't have judges that are just going to ignore that. And when you were talking about how judges settle upwards of 95% of their cases, it reminded me when I was clerking for a judge when I was in law school. He would tell civil litigants who came forward with their disputes and tell them, listen, you don't want me to decide. If you guys can work out an agreement that is acceptable to both parties, then that will probably be better, because I don't know what's most important to you. I'm just going to rule based on the law and based on, what discretion I have, but you probably don't want that. And so even in that type of posture, a lot of judges don't want to insert themselves. And so where they're kind of forced to, sometimes that does become problematic, but when they don't. But in terms of just moving forward, is there, from Judicial Watch or any of these other organizations, Russ, is there a pushback on at least the ability to preserve a challenge? Because I think so many people were frustrated that a lot of these cases weren't heard and were kicked out for lack of standing.
Yeah, I mean, we've talked about it internally. Some of the things, when you want to bring election cases, as you know, are difficult, and they're, a properly done case takes time. It takes a lot of time and a lot of facts. And to do it post-election is a Herculean task. And so I think with some of the election integrity stuff, it's important to try to bring the cases before election and just you'll deal, as long as you don't box the court in on timeline for relief, like don't show up October 15th to try to strike down a statute that had been around for 150 years in time for the November election, right? You can wait till the next election. It's been, and I think people are doing a better job for that. I mean, the Supreme Court, didn't do as much as I'd like, but did, dismiss a couple of bad rulings. And there was actually a good dissent out of Texas by Judge Oldham a few months ago talking about candidate standing and how sort of ridiculous the recent opinions have been about candidate standing and talked about how, I probably read every voting rights case and every election case for the last 125 years. I mean, there's probably very few that I've missed. And I've never seen a candidate not have standing. And if that's the case, then most of the Voting Rights Act precedent isn't applicable. And so I think there's been a pushback. I know I've spoken about it. And Judge Oldham in the Fifth Circuit recently issued a dissent, like I mentioned. He sees it. And I'm hoping going forward that will be the end of that. And I think, sometimes seeking pre-election relief is just a very difficult task because election cases are complicated. Judges, on top of desperately trying, because they're desperately trying to avoid them, they never see them. So, it takes a lot to get them up to speed. And,
yeah, well, Judicial Watch is doing a great job in furthering the national conversation because often, while the court of public opinion isn't ultimately outcome determinative and it's certainly not binding, it can be persuasive at least to get into the awareness of a lot of these judges that this is something that is going to be really important, and looking at some of these decisions where they're disagreeing with how courts have handled this, particularly on the issue of standing. And I think, your organization is doing such a great job on these issues. And you also raise a really important point that, a lot of this pre-election litigation is important to the extent that it's possible. But a lot of those cases have also been mooted out to say that the issue is not yet ripe. Like there hasn't been, for example, and the easiest way to explain this to listeners is, you can't sue someone for a harm that hasn't yet been incurred in most instances. So I can't sue someone for a car accident that may or may not happen tomorrow. You have to wait until that harm is actually realized and then go in and sue for damages. And that's why it's called damages. But in a post-election time frame, and that's what we saw in the aftermath of the 2020 election, there was just so much and so little time that it's also really difficult and very easy to run out the clock. So how do you, as an election lawyer, balance those two difficulties, that there is such a short clock, but also you have some of those ripeness issues as well in the pre-litigation?
Well, to touch on your whole standing point, I'll say, the way I explain it to people is you just can't sue because something ain't right? You have to, we all see things we don't like and you just can't go sue over it. You got to have standing. I'm fortunate enough because I don't really represent campaigns or a party. And so we have our clients that have standing and we bring our cases. And a lot of times it doesn't have the deadlines that a campaign would have. People know that, if you just run out the clock, you're great, depending on what side of the equation you're on. We try to
also like football.
yeah. You also don't want them changing the rules in the fourth quarter.
Right.
But we try to keep an eye on mootness, right? This idea that once the election's over with, your claims are over with. And so we try to keep track of that. And then, we try to press for relief as early as possible. But if the choice is no day in court or no relief, I'm going to wait it out. Because at the end of the day, election integrity takes patience. It does. And, you're not going to go in and sue and get a clean voter registration list day one. And, it's tough to be patient sometimes. I'm certainly not the most patient person, but, when we bring our cases, we think about it in that, like our list maintenance cases. I mean, we filed our case against a couple states, and then they drug it out so long, the new data's come out and actually helped us out. So, it's like they can drag it out, but it actually helps us out sometimes. And so you just got to see what facts you got and where you can go with it and go that direction. But
I think that's a really key point for Americans that, we don't like to hear, but is absolutely true, that election integrity takes patience. And there were so many people so frustrated in what we saw in the 2020 election on, all sides of things, that they lack that patience. They want to see something happen right away. But that, I think, is a very, very key and important point, that it does take patience, but there are great organizations like Judicial Watch that are working on these issues, and you have been working on these issues, not just trying to get up to speed, just because of what we learned in the 2020 election. So how can people, in the last few minutes I have with you, Russ, and thank you so much for your insights and expertise on this, how can people support Judicial Watch? I'm really glad to see Tom Fitton back on Twitter, and some of those, so I follow him, all the great work that you do, not just in election integrity, but all across the spectrum. Judicial Watch is such a great organization. How can people support the effort and the work that you're doing?
Well, really just if they just follow us online. Tom has a feed. I don't know what his feed is on Twitter, but we have obviously our Twitter feed, and I think we're on Getter and all the other social media platforms. And just follow us. And we put out a lot of stuff right now, and some things are going to really interest you, and some things may not. And just thank everyone for their support. We have a lot of support as it is, and we've Tom and Paul and Chris at Judicial Watch, they've all sort of built up what I think is a respectable cadre of election lawyers. We've got three of us that used to do litigation for the DOJ for the voting section there, and we didn't really like some of the things we saw, and so we've all gone in-house at Judicial Watch, and it gives us an opportunity to do it. And so, just follow us on social media and amplify us and let us know what you like, and we'll keep pushing along.
Which is great, and I love that you don't support any particular candidate or partisan issue, because that is also, I think, the most important point of election integrity, is that it is all about maintaining our rule of law and the enforcement of legitimate rules, and that shouldn't be a partisan issue. Unfortunately, it's become that, and we've seen that especially in the Democrats' rhetoric and the leftists, but we should all at the end of the day recognize that as Americans, we all respect and appreciate everyone's right to vote and the right to disagree and the right to support different candidates and different ideas. That's the hallmark of a constitutional republic and a foundation and a basis that we have free and fair elections in this country. And we, the people, get to select and prefer who are our elected officials, and who get, for a limited time, the powers that come with that office. And that, though the rules surrounding that should not be tipped one way or the other, they need to be nonpartisan, they need to be fundamentally fair. And so for organizations like Judicial Watch that are really doing a lot of the heavy lifting on that, that's a very, very important thing. And all Americans, regardless of what candidate or party or policy you support, should get behind that effort. So thanks so much, Russ, for joining me, and I really appreciate your insights and hope to talk to you soon.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks so much for having me, and look forward to seeing you soon.
Thanks. All right, well, 2022 is going to be a critical year for America. AMAC, the Association of Mature American Citizens, along with their nearly 2 million members. The fight to stop out-of-control spending in the president's Build Back Better scheme is far from over, and Congress is plotting more legislation that could hurt our seniors. The midterm elections will be a battle for freedom versus socialism. Unlike liberal groups, AMAC is America's conservative, action-oriented 50-plus organization fighting hard every day here in Washington and across the nation for our seniors. So I'm urging you to choose AMAC now. You will receive all of the great membership benefits, including AMAC discounts on hotels, travels, and restaurants, and your membership will support your conservative values. So go to amac.us/Ellis. That's amac.us/ELLIS to become an AMAC member now.